Welcome to the show, everyone. Wow, we've actually started live. That's a novelty for us. As you can see, I did promise I would become ever more ludicrously festive as Christmas approaches. It's been a tough year. I hope you won't begrudge it. We're getting a tree tomorrow. So basically, as we get to December 25th, I'll end up just dressed as Father Christmas by the end of it. Look, we've got an amazing show today. Absolutely astonishing show. I'll come on to that in a second. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for the support of everyone who's making this channel possible. I spent Friday in Folkestone with refugees and migrants, including those who are being locked away. It was pretty grim, pretty horrific. We're doing a video which comes out next week, which is going to shine a light on the reality of refugees, migrants. Their voices have been airbrushed out of the conversation. They've been vilified and demonized for all the ills and injustices caused by the powerful. You've made that possible. So please, if you're able to do so and support this channel, go to Patreon/OwenJones84, subscribe, go to the YouTube channel, press subscribe, press the bell so you get notifications. If you want to support and put in questions today, then use the super chat function and ping our amazing guests. Now I'm going to bring them right in. And we're talking today, of course, about the economic crisis that we're currently in, how we got here, what the consequences are likely to be, and how we're going to get out of it. And we've got two of the world's biggest and most esteemed economists to talk us through that. So I'm going to bring them in one by one. Let's start with Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana. Hello, Mariana. Hello.
Hello there. Hi.
Very good to see you. Now, Mariana, for those who don't know who she is, and I'm sure that's very few of you, is a professor of economics, of course, at UCL. She founded the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. And we're going to flash up the book that you're all now going to read, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. Get yourself a copy, and The Entrepreneurial State. Both are seminal texts and absolutely critical for understanding the situation we're currently in. Now, let's bring in our second esteemed economist, Ha-Joon Chang, who is a professor, of course, at Cambridge University. They're also the writer of several seminal works, including Economics, a User Guide, and 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. I've met, like with Mariana's book, lots of people who got engaged in economics, in politics through that work. So we're very, very honored and privileged to have you for the show this week. Now, let's just kick things off. We're going to kick things off by talking about the broken economic model that existed before the pandemic. So we're going to kick things off by looking at an interview that I did with Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. And I did that interview, of course, on the YouTube channel. Check it out. But let's just see what he had to say.
2008 was our generation's 1929. 1929 changed the world. It came at the end of a decade of irrational exuberance, the roaring 20s, with financialization together with mega corporations and network companies like Ford, motor companies like Edison and so on, going berserk. And, that period of, effectively, financialization coupled with a neoliberal logic crashed and burned in 1929. That created fascism, Nazism in Europe. It gave rise to the New Deal in the United States. In the end, an alliance of the New Dealers and the Soviet Union crushed the fascists, and we had about 2 decades between 1950 and 1970 of the golden era of capitalism, because capitalism effectively was planned.
Let's kick off with you, Mariana. So in terms of many of the things you've been looking at in terms of how broken our economic model is, private debt-led consumption, going back, of course, the crash which Yanis was talking about, bailed out by taxpayers, the socialization of risks, the privatization of rewards. And just this one statistic, and I think this in itself just underlines how broken the economic model is, that 10% of all British bank lending supports non-financial firms. The rest goes to real estate and financial assets. So if you were going to give paint a broad picture of how broken our economic model was before the crash, where would you start?
Well, exactly on those. The problem is that we sometimes forget that capitalism, or even this, word, the market, is actually an outcome of how we govern all the different institutions that co-create value. And we keep kind of pretending that value is created in business, and then at best what the policymaker can do is to fix market failures. So you have to wait for the market actually to screw up, and it does time and time again, to do something. And so what I absolutely think we need to do in order to recover properly is to admit that, first of all, that whole premise that you have the market out there that just needs to be fixed now and then is wrong. What you actually require, if we want to fix things, is a much more active, proactive market shaping and market kind of co-creating approach. And the fundamental problems that need to be fixed and that need to be, transformed have to do with what you just said. So the financial sector, which is one form of institution, I think the actual number is that only about 20%, at least in the UK, of finance even goes to the real economy. 80% goes to finance, insurance, and real estate. And, the acronym there is FIRE, which is quite convenient. Business itself, so the so-called real economy is itself financialized. So just in the last 10 years, the global Fortune 500 companies has spent over $4 trillion just in buying back their own shares to boost their stock prices, stock options, and surprise, surprise, executive pay. Inequality has been rising, at least relative inequality has been rising, and people like Piketty have, really kind of shown that data. But I think what's also not appreciated is all the narrative and the storytelling that's actually fueled that inequality. So all these regressive tax policies that he points to actually came about by a very problematic way that we even talk about, how to fuel economic growth. And it's really just been fueling inequality and financialization. And lastly, the state itself, as I was saying, just has been so reactive. And in the process, there's been a lot of hollowing out of state capacity itself. And I'm sure we'll get to this later in the conversation. But what's incredible is how much, say, the UK government has had to use consulting companies, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, McKinsey, both to manage Brexit and now also COVID. And, there's nothing inevitable in that. That's very much due to the lack of investment in-house in government to be able to, again, shape and co-create and manage an economy. And this over-reliance on outsourcing, forget privatization, which we all know, what happened there, but even just the outsourcing of the knowledge, the kind of learning capacity of the state has really withered away. And lastly, climate change. This is huge. So just last year in 2019, subsidies to fossil fuel companies were $20 billion a year in the US and $55 billion a year in the EU, also the UK, which is still in the EU. So, this just shows just how much transformation we have to do. And then COVID hit. And of course, in the meantime, it all just becomes worse. So debt, for example, is just getting worse because people require debt just to, survive right now. And the ratio, even before COVID, of private debt, not public debt, which everyone obsesses about, private debt to disposable income was just as high as it was just before the financial crisis, before COVID hit. And that's what caused the financial crisis. And none of the papers, none of the election manifestos were even talking about that. And also a lot of the recovery schemes, if you look at what's happening globally, a lot of that has actually been going to fossil fuel projects. So I think of the G20 governments, 56% of recovery funds have actually been handed to fossil fuel projects. Just to say, this is not, a situation that looks like we're actually trying even to do better, let alone what we absolutely have to do now, given the, health tragedy that we're experiencing globally.
Ha-Joon, I mean, when the financial crash hit, there was a sense that the old economic model had been self-evidently discredited, and that something new would have to rise from the rubble. Now, unfortunately, that didn't happen. I mean, how do you explain how it was, the crash of 2008, which became transformed into a crisis of public spending, which obviously underlied the logic of austerity? How did that happen, and how exposed did that leave us to the crisis we're currently in?
Yeah, I think that basically the neoliberals have succeeded in defending the status quo by controlling the narrative very well. The one thing that we all have to realize is that people, actually, even people who are critical of the neoliberalism very often misunderstand what it is, because neoliberals have used two things to hide what it really is. One is gross machismo. So this argument that yes, that people might get bruised and the inequality might rise here and there, but this is the system that creates more growth. And another is that this fatality of the rising inequality. The argument being, look, it's got nothing to do with the economic policies because of low wages in China. It's because of globalization. It's that because of technological change that make lots of workers worthless. But actually, if you look at the record, this is completely wrong. The economic growth has actually fallen during the neoliberal age. Between the 1950s and 80s, the world economy grew at about 2.6% per year on per capita basis. I mean, the exact number depends on exactly which years and which data that you look at. But at about 2.6%. Since then, the world economy has been growing at only about 1.4, 1.5, basically half the rate. Yeah? And then we still think that this is a pro-growth regime. It's not actually, for all the reasons that Mariana very eloquently explained. It does not invest, does not grow. And as for the inequality, actually a lot of inequality outcome depends on what kind of policies you do in terms of the regulation of market forces and tax and redistribution. So actually in the last 3-4 decades of neoliberalism, inequality has risen only a tiny bit in Canada and the Netherlands, and it has fallen in France, and there the evidence is less clear, but it seems to have fallen in Switzerland as well. Yeah? So these are the economies that are even more exposed to the forces of global capitalism, maybe other than except for France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Canada. They are all small, very open economies, right at the forefront of technological progress, and they've been able to contain inequality. So it's only because they don't want to control inequality that inequality keeps rising. And then when the crisis happened, they still kept going with the same narrative. And then what's the result? I mean, you still have the same low growth. The quality of employment has fallen because a lot of people are now on the very unstable contracts. A lot of people are in self-employment out of desperation rather than true entrepreneurial zeal. And inequality still keeps rising in many countries. So actually, we need to take back this narrative. I mean, we should not start by saying that, yes, this doctrine may be good at generating economic growth, but we need to take care of inequality. We need to take care of poor people. No, it's not like that. Yeah. So I think that we have to really start casting this in new light. And Mariana's work has made a lot of important contributions in understanding why this apparent pro-growth regime based on maximum market power and deregulated finance is actually a system that is not even good at creating growth, not to speak about maintaining quality of employment and inequality.
I mean, Mariana, the point there about what we'd call neoliberalism, which has been hegemonic, I suppose, for about 4 decades now, and its promise, of course, was to unleash market forces which were being restrained by the oppressive deadweight of the state and collectivism. That was the rationale. And and obviously, actually, in that period, we've had before the pandemic 3 massive economic crises. We've had stagnating living standards in Britain and in the United States and other places for a very long time, as well as a very unbalanced economy. But I mean, the point you make, and which I think is the entrepreneurial state popularized, was if I take my phone here, there's my nephew and my niece. This phone, people, the advocates of free market fundamentalism would say, here is the absolute kind of crowning glory, the demonstration of the power of market economics. But this iPhone is full of components which were made by state innovation.
Yes. So, well, let's say everything that makes it smart and not stupid, right? You don't say, oh, let me pick up my idiotic phone. So what makes the smartphone smart is the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. These are all technologies that were actually funded by state organizations. And let's not forget that some of those were in Europe. So we wouldn't have the World Wide Web without CERN, a big public laboratory in Europe. And it wasn't just public money. What's even more interesting is that it was public money out of public organizations, so state-led organizations like DARPA in the US, which was fundamental for the internet, which were not there to, again, fix market failures or even to incentivize or de-risk business. They were mission-oriented. They had problems they wanted to solve, right? So the internet actually came about because they needed to solve a problem, which was to get the satellites to communicate. Or GPS came about because the Navy, the U.S. Navy, needed to know how to, more precisely know where the ships were, also, to go to war. So these wartime kind of Cold War objectives often then led as spillovers to all these technologies. Software itself, we would not have software today had we not tried to get to the moon. And everyone should, see the wonderful film on the African-American women behind that, Hidden Figures. And so what's interesting about these spillovers, again, is that there were spillovers from problem solving. So the real question today that we should be asking, besides fighting the neoliberal agenda, which I kind of feel like, that's sort of been fought, let's now move forward to the, productive and proactive agenda, is what are today's problems that require us to be mission oriented around? And we have these 17 sustainable development goals. They were not handed down, top down by some, boring experts. They were actually outcomes of a huge stakeholder kind of conversation around the world that the UN fostered. We have these 17 goals that all these countries, including the UK, basically every country has signed up to them. These are huge problems that we need to solve. And we're not going to solve them by just talking about them in places like Davos or in the, non or neoliberal kind of settings. It's about, what's the investment trajectory? What's the value chain kind of changes that we need? What is the proper, public-private partnership that we require to get there? And these PPPs and PFI schemes that in the UK have, to a large extent, actually destroyed a lot of public institutions, including public health. We should remember that we shouldn't then just bash any public-private partnership. Again, getting to the moon was not just NASA. There was lots of investment by companies like General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola, but they entered that problem because they were invited to do so through very dynamic procurement policies with a very strong public kind of state-led goal that they wanted to achieve. And they said to the companies, hey, help us, come in and help us do, X, Y, and Z. There was lots of bottom-up experimentation, but the motive was not commercialization or being business friendly, this word that always seems to circulate. It wasn't about being business friendly. It was about kind of real, what I call mutualistic and symbiotic partnership towards a goal. And unfortunately, so many of the policies that we have today, how we give out grants, how we give out loans, how we give out bailouts, bailout schemes during a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis or a COVID crisis, is not set up that way. It's not about actually achieving a goal together with strong conditions attached. It's kind of like, we need business to, come into a sector, including space, by the way, today, where there's lots of business activity in space, as an end in itself. We think that introducing business into an area is the end in itself, and we forget what the objective is, right? Even the vaccine, to be honest, I don't know if we're going to get to that later, so I'll just say it, when you say race to a vaccine, and we are racing for a vaccine, that's a problem, because if you're just rushing, and then you don't think about what does it look like to really collaborate together so that the vaccine itself fulfills a mission, it solves a problem, which means it has to be universally accessible, and we can't have the patent system and the pricing system that gets used in the process to exclude so many people from accessing it. That's a problematic partnership. So whether we're talking about a vaccine or building a health system or building a carbon neutral city, or setting up a whole new kind of data commons in a city in order for the city to improve its public transport, how we actually work together. We need to fight for much better contracts and details of how these collaborations are formed. And I do think that the COVID-19 moment is the moment to do that, because there's trillions being poured into the system across the world. In the UK, lots of different, types of recovery schemes being handed also to business. And if we don't introduce conditionality to that, we are really missing the trick. And it's quite curious that in the UK, we haven't done that. So in France, Macron was very clear. He said, we're not here to save business, right? This business-friendly idea. We're here to help transform it during the crisis. So there were strong conditions attached to the bailout schemes that both Renault got, that Air France got. They had to reduce their carbon emissions as part of that pact. Or in Denmark, they said, those companies that are using tax havens cannot, access the recovery. Even in the US under Trump, they talked about, the need to make sure that companies that were accessing the US recovery wouldn't just use it, say, on dividend payouts and share buybacks. Whereas in the UK, we simply gave, say, EasyJet, a 600 million a bailout with no conditions attached. And EasyJet was quite clear. They said, we don't want conditions attached. So that, we need a complete change in mentality. And just talking about neoliberal economics, I think, doesn't get us there. We really have to get our hands dirty in what that looks like.
So let's really zero in on the pandemic, on the economic impact and the current responses. And let's just start with Rishi Sunak, who obviously is Chancellor of the Exchequer, and his speech to the Commons, the spending review this last week.
If this spending review's first priority was getting the country through coronavirus, and its second was stronger public services, then our final priority is to deliver our record investment plans in infrastructure. Capital spending next year will total £100 billion, £27 billion more in real terms than last year. Our plans deliver the highest sustained level of public investment in more than 40 years. Once-in-a-generation plans to deliver once-in-a-generation returns for our country.
So before we just talk about specifically the response, let's just give everyone a real sense of the economic impact of this. Ha-Joon, start with you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's sum up in the scale of, the Great Depression and so on. How big is the economic impact? How bad is the economic long-term impact of coronavirus?
Yeah, well, to put it into perspective, this year world economies are projected to shrink by around 5%. After the 2008 global financial crisis, it shrank only by 1%. It shrank more during the Great Depression, but it is definitely the biggest economic contraction since the Great Depression. In terms of unemployment, at one point in the US, unemployment rate that was over 20%. That's the level that we saw only during the Great Depression, not before, not after. So yeah, this is kind of a huge crisis. Now, to be fair, people are suffering less than what they did during the Great Depression because, despite the constant attempt to dismantle it, we have a much bigger welfare state today compared to the days of the Great Depression. So a lot of people have been spared the worst of the effects, but we have a lot of people suffering through unemployment, cuts in earnings, and so on. Mainly because the governments of the UK, the US, and many other rich countries have totally mismanaged the pandemic itself and created this unnecessary trade-off between health and the economy. If you look at the countries that successfully managed the pandemic, New Zealand, Finland, South Korea, Norway, as well as quite a lot of developing countries like Vietnam, Rwanda, and so on. If you contain the disease at the low level, actually most things can remain open. Most things are open in Korea, other than occasional the ban on the spectators in the spectator sports or brief shutting down of the clubs and so on. Everything has been open. The country has never had to impose lockdown. So we first have to fight this government narrative that they are making unpalatable choices between economy and health. That's a false choice that has resulted from mismanagement of the pandemic. And we need to start from the point, that we need to get the priorities right. keeping people healthy, safe, and fed. This government that which needs a footballer to tell them to keep a free school meal to children during vacation is willing to splash out $16 billion on defense spending to protect the country from whom? Koreans? I mean, this is an absolute scandal. I mean, that we really need to use this as an opportunity to talk about our social priorities again. Is it that health? Is it that child poverty? Is it that green restructuring? We are progressing as if nothing has happened. I mean, we are still talking about 90s and 90s.
Yeah. So Mariana, I mean, in terms of the scale of the economic impact, and how would you judge as well? I mean, if you look in the government, if I was going to be a spokesperson for the Conservative government, which is certainly a shift in my career trajectory, they would say we've taken these huge decisions: the furlough scheme, the self-employment scheme. About half the country's wages were being paid by the state. Huge, generous package. What would you say to that in terms of the scale of the shock and the government's existing response?
Well, I mean, we should also give credit where it's due, because some countries didn't have furlough schemes, right? So it's very good we had one, and it absolutely should be extended. People should actually be paid to, work at home. And unfortunately, many people can't work at home. The digital divide is massive. I see this in London. I have 4 children. They'll go to state schools. And if, my kids, like Ha-Joon's kids, I'm sure are getting quite a bit of support at home, get good broadband, have all sorts of our nice little smart gadgets, again, government financed, in the house, but many don't. So what do again, the details really matter. The furlough scheme was very important. It is very important. It should be extended. But how to make sure that this period doesn't become one, which it is becoming, where these deep inequalities in the UK economy, but in many different economies, just get deeper and deeper. Again, the work at home thing, many people with nice gardens, big houses, great internet, that's one possibility, but many don't have that. So that itself requires a lot of government problem solving. Coming back to my mission-oriented obsession before, this is because I've been working now for almost 10 years trying to help policy design change. So it's less about handouts, to false categories like SMEs, but really kind of problem solving. And then how do you help the SMEs in that process of solving a problem, as opposed to focusing on these kind of static categories. But one of the biggest problems I see right now is that because the UK government and other governments did react, and that's a good thing, then they're already starting to talk about, oh dear, we're going to have to put, the public finances in order. So, already, or last week, I can't remember what date it is today, Sunday, last week with the spending review announcements, there was lots of talk of, they didn't use the word austerity, but basically implied it because of, the high level of public debt. But this is, of course, a moment where you just shouldn't care about public debt, which, by the way, in the UK is in no way kind of astronomical in terms of debt to GDP. It's still at a level which, one shouldn't necessarily worry about. But the real question is, are we in the meantime, the things that we are investing in and spending on, including the furlough scheme, which requires expenditure from the government, but especially this idea of really also fostering green jobs and a green transition at the same time, that's all about the long run. So if you are both in the short run, making the expenditures and the investments we need in a crisis situation, but doing it in a design kind of thinking kind of way, in such a way that does also foster long run growth, but not growth for growth's sake, but green growth and resilient growth, because we're making our citizens healthier, so strengthening our health system instead of undermining it as we have over the last decades, that's going to be great for the long run, growth prospects. And so even if you're someone who obsesses about debt to GDP, you should be, thinking that way, because that means that the denominator, the GDP bit, will have a good long run trajectory. I'm from Italy. And Italy, the misperception in Europe is that the southern European countries, the ones that Goldman Sachs called the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. I can say that because I'm Italian. If you have a German saying pigs, they'll get pissed off. The misperception is that those countries, just were kind of profligate and just spending too much. In fact, it's the opposite. They have historically had public sectors that weren't investing enough. And all the things that the Northerners, who like to talk about themselves as tightening their belts, were actually quite profligate on. So they have proper public banks. They have great public institutions that foster science-industry linkages, like the Fraunhofer Institutes, which in Germany spend 10 times more than, say, the UK does on its catapults. They have really strong vocational training. And all these things really matter also during a crisis, right? If you have workers in certain sectors who've been invested in historically to increase their so-called human capital, they will then transition, whether it's to a green transition or to a digitalization transition, much better, because those are the underlying kind of technological shifts that we have right now with our global capitalist system. So Italy has actually had a lower, believe it or not, a lower deficit than Germany historically, but a much, much higher debt to GDP. Why? Because it wasn't investing. Neither the private sector, which has been quite inertial, as many private companies are, they tend to sometimes just be happy with the status quo, and the public sector has been very inertial, not making these long-run investments in education, research and development, health, etc. So the irony is that you can have a low deficit but a very high debt to GDP. And even just something as basic as that, which is just basic maths, because you'll remember, I'm sure you remember, Owen, in your A-level math class that you took, that when you have 0 in the denominator, the ratio can go to infinity, right? So debt to GDP, if the denominator is not growing, even if the numerator, the debt is growing by, say, 2 or 3% per year, the ratio can actually, get very high. Even just something as basic as that isn't really well understood. So people after the financial crisis were made to really fear this notion of public debt and public deficits. And luckily this time around, as Ha-Joon was saying, in some ways we haven't had that massive wave of austerity. We did have governments, making the kind of $1 trillion, trillion euro, trillion pound kind of investments. But the problem is that if that's not accompanied with a narrative, a fundamentally new story about what kind of economy we actually want to build in the long run, what you get is 2 or 3 months or 6 months or 1 year later, going back to square one and talking about, oh, okay, we reacted, we did the furlough scheme, we did the investment plan, but now let's start tightening our belts again. And that will be a disaster, because we hit COVID in this country, in the UK, on the back of a decade of austerity. So our health system that we ended up, clapping on the Thursdays had been decimated. It was a real insult, I think, for the health workers that we were clapping them and yet still don't know how to value them. We have, underlying inequalities that have increased because of austerity, which have made people so much more vulnerable. And we haven't really thought about work. So many of the types of work structures that we have in different jobs in the gig economy have just made people incredibly vulnerable to any form of crisis, whether it's a health crisis, a climate crisis, or a financial crisis. And if we don't get this right now, we're in big trouble, because this is not the last crisis we're going to be going through.
I mean, Ha-Joon, just picking up that point Mariana made about, applauding, of course, the key workers every week. And I've been interviewing key workers over the last few weeks who say we hugely appreciate it, but it doesn't pay the bills. But it's the reason I'm also interested in that is, often the fact that Britain has, the fact it has the worst death toll in Europe and potentially the worst economic shock is often portrayed as due to incompetence on the part of the government. And of course, I'm not suggesting they have been competent in their response, but it seems to me that actually what's missing from that discussion is a lot of it was to do with market dogma. I mean, for example, the Sunday Times a few months ago did a brilliant piece of investigative journalism that personal protective equipment had, because of austerity, those stocks had been left to decay and became useless. The fact they locked down too late, despite the scenes in northern Italy, was to do with what they were doing is prioritizing as they saw economic interests ahead of public health. Well, actually, unless you deal with the public health crisis, you can't deal with an economic crisis. You make it worse. But also the fact that they reopened the economy, go back to work or lose your job on the front of the Telegraph at the end of August, without having a functioning test and trace system in place, because they handed it to shambolic private contractors who have catastrophically failed. I mean, isn't this partly a story? It's not actually so much about incompetence in terms of the terrible public health and therefore the economic crisis being worsened, but it was dogma in all of these cases that led to the scale of the disaster.
That's right. No, I would call it structural incompetence. It's not individuals working in the government being stupid or anything. I'm sure that there are such people, but it's generally about what Mariana mentioned earlier. I mean, that destruction of capabilities within the government, because now the government is basically a contracting agency. It doesn't have any in-house capacity, and it has to pay huge amount of money to these very expensive consulting companies to manage anything. Yeah? So actually, it's just channeling money. It doesn't have its own capacity, and that's what's creating this the problem. But also, it's the economic structure that made this opening of economy kind of quite necessary. I mean, I already said that failure of the initial health management has created this false choice, kind of artificial trade-off. But having created that trade-off, there's a greater compulsion to open the economy, because so many people were dependent on this precarious service sector jobs. Unless you open the pubs, unless you open the bars, people wouldn't make a living. You know? Unless you kind of force these delivery workers to go around and without realizing spread the disease, you couldn't keep the economy going, because the core capacity of the economy has been destroyed in the last 3-4 decades of neoliberal policy that deprived it of productive investment. And if I may just add one quick thing, that Mariana already explained it very well, but the point is that we need to change the conversation about debt. I mean, she emphasized that growing the denominator, that is GDP, is very important, more important than reducing the numerator. But also, we have to keep telling people that, look, this is a huge economic crisis. If the government doesn't run that, individuals and companies will have to run that. Yeah? And they have much higher risk of going bankrupt. Yeah? Especially individuals, if they go bankrupt, their life will be ruined. So it's actually economically more rational, not just efficient, not just more kind of equitable for the government to contract that in times like this. You know? Because if you withdraw all these furlough schemes and go into austerity, there'll be far many cases of bankruptcy and the ruined lives and suicides and so on. Then having a higher public debt, and when you may or may not have some economic trouble as a result of that. I mean, let's not forget that after the Second World War, the UK government had huge debt. Yeah, I mean, something like 200% of debt, equivalent to 200% of GDP. It reduced this debt mainly through growth over decades. Yeah, I mean, this pandemic is a crisis comparable to World War II. You cannot reduce this kind of debt through this austerity measures and penny pinching. Yeah, we have to change the conversation.
I mean, in terms of what comes next, I mean, there's a few things I want to talk about. Partly the vaccine, by the way, Big Pharma. Really want to hear some thoughts on that in terms of the dangers of austerity, but also an alternative economic agenda. But first, let's just look at something Mariana said to Channel 4 News back in April.
You don't send soldiers to the battleground barefoot, right? So the weakness in some ways of our public health system, as great as it is, and yes, we all clap on Thursdays, it is an insult to simply clap and not also to strengthen the system itself so it can continually, systemically actually be strong. So it will be prepared also for the next crisis, because unfortunately, this won't be the last.
I mean, in terms of strengthening it, is the danger that the opposite may well now happen, in that Boris Johnson actually said, he promised that austerity would not be that there would not be a return to austerity. Boris Johnson is not known for sticking to his pledges. He's actually been sacked twice for lying, once by his party leader, once by a newspaper editor. But also, the fact we're already talking at the moment about a public sector pay freeze, which in practice is a cut, and many public sector workers suffered a 14% cut in real wages. They're exempting NHS workers, but obviously these are the key workers who were applauded every Thursday, as you said, venerated, and then obviously their pockets emptied. I mean, you know, we're already hearing outriders of free market think tanks talking about the need. You know, they're laying the intellectual and political foundations for austerity. I mean, what do you think? Are we going to see a return to austerity?
Well, first of all, I think we should do exactly what you were saying before, Owen, which is to debunk the words, right? There was never austerity, actually. The government, even during austerity, continued to waste a huge amount of money, for example, with the consultancy companies, right? So we should be careful. Like, we should, you know, use words that are much more precise, right? Which is destroying the public healthcare system at the same time that you are having corporate welfare or just wasting billions on the consulting companies. That's still public money. So austerity just sounds like you're just cutting all the public, you know, spend, and it's not that. It's a much more, as you were saying, Owen, kind of ideological steering of the economy in a certain way. Even deregulation, by the way, is not, you know, just hands-off policy. Deregulation is a choice to foster a certain type of growth over another. And, you know, after, I mean, just to bring in some numbers here, because Ha-Joon was mentioning the point about consultancy companies that I raised earlier. So after Brexit, the government increased the amount it was spending on consultancy companies by 1.5 billion pounds. You know, let's cut that, not the public sector pay. Or, you know, even just under COVID in the last year, 56 million on consultants, to the point that Lord Agnew, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is it Agnew or Agnew, said that, you know, this kind of obsession with consultancy companies is infantilizing, a really interesting expression, infantilizing government. We're actually weakening government. Again, that is through a choice. And if we just say the word austerity, it sounds like we're not even spending on anything. No, we're spending on specific things and not on other things. So, you know, we've already reviewed this point about why we then shouldn't be obsessing around public debt, especially because it was private debt that got us into the financial crisis. And private debt is what is unsustainable, because what is true for a household is not true for a government. But that would bring us into a whole other conversation, which if you want to, we can go down that rabbit hole, but let's just admit that. So what we actually need right now, if we want to be, you know, really kind of proactive and constructive, because I do think it's easy also just to kind of bash a lot of things, and I do it all the time. But let's think what actually needs to happen now. Yes, of course, we need public investment. We need to strengthen our health system, but we especially need to listen to the people working in that health system, right? Speak to the nurses, speak to the doctors. Remember the strike by the junior doctors who were, you know, in tears, because it's very hard if you're a doctor to be striking because you know the patients that you're not serving. You know, that whole battle, which was pre-COVID, let's address that properly and listen to the doctors and the nurses and to the care workers, all the different care workers who've been crying for years now about the system being on brink of collapse. Let's construct that system, fund it, yes, but fund it in a proper way that is really about kind of stakeholder conversations with the people working in it, as opposed to just some minister wanting his or her name on some new plan, you know, some new agency, some new budget that's going to be set aside for that. We really need to do things differently. And, you know, coming back to the point before about some developing countries like Kerala and Vietnam actually did incredibly well during this crisis, but not just because they, you know, chose one or two things to do, but, you know, this has been on the back of decades of investment in those regions on public administration. You know, they actually administered this crisis much better because they invested in their public administration. And so what does that mean? You know, I mean, this is why I've actually set up a whole institute for public purpose, because I really believe that if we don't, you know, part of this new narrative that both Ha-Joon and I have been talking about, that needs to be accompanied by also a discussion about what are the new capabilities and capacity that you need within the state if you are going to be actively shaping the economy, transforming the economy, not just constantly fixing it. That requires a new type of training actually for the civil service itself. We've bought into this public choice theory and new public management theory, which has been a spillover from the kind of Chicago school economics that has almost convinced civil servants that government failure is even worse than market failure. So just do your little correction and then get out of the way for, you know, the market or the, you know, private sector to provide. And that, you know, we know now that doesn't work. So what are the alternative tools? What does it mean for how we reorganize our fiscal policy, our monetary policy, the grants, the loans, the procurement policy? It's those kinds of discussions we need now. And what's really interesting with procurement, and I am a bit of a nerd with procurement because people don't realize just how large procurement budgets are. I mean, just to give you an idea, in the UK, the procurement budget, this is government as purchaser, not just as investor, for the Ministry of Transport is close to 40 billion pounds. The entire innovation budget for the whole country is not even 10 billion. So if you can transform the levers that government has, like procurement, to be a funnel for innovation, for experimentation, to actually solve big public problems around public transport, public education, public health, you've just increased the kind of innovation budget, right? To actually do things much better, to do them differently, to invest in-house in the ability of the civil service itself to manage, crisis after crisis. And ideally, we won't then have so many crises, because the climate crisis and the health crisis and the financial crisis are endogenous, to how we currently work, to how we, the kind of capitalism that we have. And I really hope that the history books, because I've got 4 kids who actually all study history, I really hope the history books will one day talk about this period that we're living through as really the kind of before and after moment, where we woke up and started to make these really needed investments in our capacity to govern our economic and social system differently. And one, just quick, sorry, go on.
No, go on.
No, go on.
Well, we'll have to that. I mean, in the coming weeks and months, we're already hearing it, that we're going to hear more and more right-wing pundits, right-wing politicians, right-wing newspapers banging the drum about debts, about this is a growing existential crisis to the economy. The money has run out. A BBC politics correspondent, who I won't name, last week spoke about how basically there is the credit card has been maxed out, using all sorts of economically illiterate comparisons. How is that going to be rebutted? And are you confident about Labour, for example? Where do you think Labour are at with this narrative, and how can they push back, or if they're willing to do so?
Well, I wouldn't comment on the Labour Party's position on this, but I have already made it clear that we need to change our conversation about that. If the public sector doesn't run that, the private sector individuals will have to run that, because this is an economic crisis. But more importantly, we I don't know, maybe it's that Christian theology. I'm not a Christian, so I don't know whether it is there, but somehow in this country, there's this notion that that is somehow a sin, But why is it that, companies borrow money to invest, and then they earn even more money? That's not a sin. People that borrow money to kind of buy a house, which gives them a more stable life, that's not a sin, So this idea that somehow having debt itself is wrong, that should be purged. I mean, basically, we have to ask whether this debt is necessary, whether it is going to bring a better future than what we have today, which requires the thorough investigation of how the money is being used and exactly how in which areas. So we need to change this conversation about that. If the government is going to say that that should be reduced at all costs, then they should also scrap student loans. I mean, their logic in promoting student loans, which I don't approve, but their logic is that when they borrow money and go to college, they can get new skills and get a better paying job. So the same logic, the government could borrow money, invest in new technologies, new infrastructure, new public services, and make the economy more productive. And then the debt will be more than justified. I just don't understand this, obsessive the idea that somehow having debt itself is a sin. It depends on when you have it, why you have it, how you are using the money, and we need to change this moralistic, one-dimensional. Frankly, the medieval thinking on that.
Mariana, can I just say something? On that, again, just thinking about the concept, Owen, that you threw into the table, which is actually this is ideological. When we go to war, Does anyone ever worry about where the money's going to come from? Like, did you ever hear, oh, we're not going to fight World War II because there's no money. Oh, we won't go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or Iran. They find the money, and especially in countries with their own sovereign currency. Or now, as you were pointing out before, they're going to, massively increase the defense budget. So really, the question is, what are we prioritizing? And we know that when it's a security risk, when we are convinced because someone convinces us about that we have to go to war, that's the priority. We do it. And in the past, what was interesting was that, especially if you think of the whole military industrial complex, not only was this urgency to go to war and the whole kind of, Cold War narrative around that, but because it was also nested within what we call a national innovation system. So you had defense agencies also investing a lot of money in all the value chain for all the products that were needed to fight the war. Actually, that also increased jobs and skills. And there were, again, those spillovers. But that's not the kind of, direction for the economy we want. We don't want a wartime direction. What we actually require is to treat with the same level of urgency that we treat wartime scenarios. We need to treat the planet. And the planet, it is urgent, as Greta Thunberg, now a 16-year-old tells us all the time, when your house is on fire, you get the hell out. You don't just debate and navel gaze about it. And, as I mentioned before, our financial system's on fire. Literally, we are, putting 80% of finance back into fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. I'm just playing around with the acronym there, but we have a really dysfunctional form of capitalism. We have huge priorities that we should be treating as urgencies. And the health pandemic has just made that so clear. Incredibly clear, but we have the climate crisis, we have huge levels of inequality. If we started to really invest in long-term, smart, strategic areas that make people's well-being, better, that make our cities less polluted, that make our, that actually create, say, a digital commons. Data is increasingly a human right. If people don't, have access to not just broadband, but really to even understand the emergent kind of digitalized economy, they just can't even interact with it. We should be massively investing in that, and that will create a more resilient economy, but that requires new institutions, new structures, new training, and that would be an incredibly useful way to also direct the current recovery fund so that when people do get back to work, they are, not part of a gig economy where, you're being paid by the hour, and then if you can't work, you have nothing, you have no pension, you have no health benefits, but you are a functional member of society that is valued. And I think this concept of essential workers and key workers, they're called different things around the world. We need to make sure this becomes a thorn in the side. If they're so essential, how do we value that kind of work? How do we pay for that kind of work? How do we make sure that people who are on the front line have a dignified life and are not fearful for the tomorrow? Sorry, I keep talking too much, so I'll let you come back.
Yeah, before I come on as well to the climate emergency, the vaccine. We may have several vaccines on the way. Hooray for Big Pharma, private sector innovation. Maybe we should start banging our pots and pans to thank Big Pharma every Thursday out of our windows. What would you say to that in terms of Mariana? And they'll say, finally we'll have this return to normal thanks to the great efforts of Big Pharma, and people around the world, regardless of which country they live in, will be immunized as a result. What would you say to all of that?
So, I've written endlessly about this. And so I actually once called my husband and I said, if I don't come home, it was Pfizer. I had been invited, this was about 7 years ago, to give, I don't know why they invited me, but the opening to the life sciences strategy, launch here in the UK. It was a minister who invited me. And what I did was put up on the screen the amount of money that Pfizer was using just to buy back their shares, again, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay versus the R&D budget that they love to talk about. And it's not that Pfizer doesn't spend on R&D. Of course they do. But Pfizer, like all these companies, are part of a very strong global ecosystem with huge amounts of public money. In the US, $40 billion a year is what the national publicly financed institutes of health spend on drug innovation. And then the state hasn't governed that process for the public interest. They then allow the patent system to get abused. So patents, intellectual property rights, they're too wide. They're used for strategic reasons. They're too deep, so they're hard to license. They're too upstream. So we're actually privatizing the tools for research as opposed to how patents are supposed to be used, which is more downstream. And so governing health innovation has been on the agenda for a long time of different researchers, but also organizations like WHO, governing it better. But this crisis really shows us just how bad it is. So Gilead has been charging, it's a large pharmaceutical company, $3,120, I think, for its COVID-19 drug called remdesivir. And it was developed with I think it's $71 million from the National Institutes of Health. And of course, Gilead also contributed to that. But how can we then not make sure that the prices for the drugs reflect that public contribution? So we're socializing risks and privatizing rewards, a phrase that you used in the beginning. We did that also with the financial crisis, bailing out companies like Goldman Sachs, in bad times, and then good times come, and it's all because of entrepreneurship. But the vaccine itself, what's really important is, first of all, that we foster as much global experimentation around it and really allow global researchers to learn from each other. So we need a collaborative approach, not a competitive one. And this is why, again, the World Health Organization has been arguing for a people's vaccine, which makes sure that we foster what they call collective intelligence by pooling all the patents so that, we can actually have a patent pool that global researchers can tap into, and also then to make sure that we have production capacity, right? So we need to make sure that we have learning between researchers, but also that then once the vaccines are discovered and tested, we can massively produce them and make them universally available and accessible. And that second point of production comes back to this issue of, what we were talking about before. If you, in the meantime, have outsourced all your capacity as a government, you're not going to actually be able to manage the governance of production of the amount of vaccines that you require, just like we haven't been able to manage the test and trace system. So currently, I think there's two big issues that aren't so much on the agenda, or people aren't talking about it enough, which is how do we make sure we govern the technological change for the vaccine to make sure it fuels public interest and not private profits, given how important it is, and how do we make sure we have the production capacity on the ground to roll out as many vaccines as we actually need.
So just finally for both of you, and also thank you, Pat, for throwing in a question about Melanie Rebeck's work on post-growth entrepreneurship, which she's urging us all to check out, which I certainly will. Ha-Joon, the climate emergency. I mean, some would say that this could be seen as a dress rehearsal, that we've gone through this huge international emergency of a sort that no one has experienced since World War II. But we face an existential threat, of course, as a species. We have about 10 years, according to the UN, to bring global temperature increase below 1.5 centigrade above pre-industrial global temperatures, or will face catastrophic consequences. But what this pandemic has shown is if the state has the will, then it can mobilize vast resources, vast amounts of money to deal with a huge problem. So what do you think the lessons are from this, and how can we use this to argue to transform our economy, to make it just and sustainable given the looming threat of that climate emergency?
Yeah, the pandemic has shown that the humanity is bound in a single fate, and that no way is the same logic applicable to the challenge of climate change. So yeah, I think it has been a good training ground for concerted public action on a global scale, and actually it is more dependent on the political will rather than the technologies or capacities, because in this pandemic we have seen that very poor countries like Vietnam, Ethiopia, Indian state of Kerala, they have managed this pandemic very well. And the climate change challenge also requires same kind of mobilization. And even in areas like intellectual property rights, going back to the vaccine thing a bit, these pharmaceutical companies have already actually got a lot of money from the government. And they are saying that we are not going to charge the full price during the pandemic. But what if the WHO declares the pandemic to be over? Then the developing countries will have to pay a huge amount of money. But then we have to realize that even in the current intellectual property rights system, backed up by this so-called TRIPS agreement in the World Trade Organization, even in that arrangement, we can restrict the patentee rights. You know? I mean, the government can force the patent pool. The U.S. government has already done it with airplane during the First World War, and semiconductors in the 1960s, basically forcing companies to share technology to allow the technological progress that proceed more easily. You can suspend the patents for public purposes. You can force that compulsory licensing, that is the licensing at a reasonable price mandated by the public government. And once again, the U.S. actually used the threat to use those provisions in order to extract something like 85% discount on this drug Cipro, this anti-anthrax drug, when it had this anthrax scare back in 2001. So there are, even in this diminished environment for government intervention, there are all these provisions. The fact is, the problem is that we don't even know that they are there. Yeah? I mean, we are not even using what can be used. We are not even mobilizing the capacities that we have, mainly because there is no political will. You know, I just don't understand how you can sleep at night as the prime minister or the government ministers when your country has killed in the per capita terms 200 more times people than Vietnam has. You know, something like 80 people, around 80 people in the 100,000 has died from COVID-19 in the UK. In Vietnam, that number is 0.04. Yeah? So, you know, I just don't understand how this distorted sense of priority is allowed. And when you get that right, that you can mobilize resources for these big challenges ahead of us, including climate change.
But, you know, the examples that Ha-Joon just gave with the U.S. semiconductors, again, when it was for the war, they did it. And, exactly. You know, there's the Defense Production Procurement Act, which can be, you know, enacted at any time in the U.S. when there's a security concern, where the U.S. did, like in World War II and also after the Korean War, transform industrial production to, you know, serve the wartime effort. And that's an extreme, you know, scenario. And by the way, that only was successful also because the trade unions were fundamental in the US, the labor unions, to help that transformation. That's something we haven't talked enough about. But, you know, labor's share of wealth globally is at a record low. The profit share is at a record high. That is not due to some inevitability of globalization and technological change. That's due to the massive lack of power that labor has had right now, also because of the union bashing, et cetera. But also, it's not only bad for workers, it's not only bad for their wages and their power, it's also bad for the economy when we need such a quick and strong shift, right? When we actually need to govern an economy better. In the past, like in World War II, without the trade unions, they would not have been able to transform auto production to defense production. And, you know, why can't we use with the same level of, again, urgency, but also inspiration and stakeholder kind of coming together to fight a common battle today? Because we've withered away the budgets, the capacity, the capability, but also the story of what's required to get there. And I think time is up, so I don't want to go on.
Well,
but
just very quickly,
we absolutely need a new story.
Yeah, I mean, you just to wrap up, I mean, you wrote this brilliant article for Time. It's 2023. Here's how we fixed the global economy, which is, I mean, you know, you write in it: carbon neutral cities, energy efficient buildings, revamp public transport, you know, the transformation of the public square, digital revolution. I mean, that's the optimistic vision that's within our grasp, if there was the will.
It's possible. It is possible. I mean, every time the government gives out a penny to industry, there's a contract, right? You don't just kind of, open up a piggy bank and throw it out the window. There's contracts in place. So if we introduce conditionality And I think it's good to end with that because it's such a important, concrete concept that's different from just talking about public-private partnership or PFI. It's a conditionality attached to any sort of public subsidy, bailout, a guarantee of really building back better. Then, of course, what I talked about in the Time article can happen. Look at the huge amounts, the trillions that are being poured into the system. If that was conditional on companies actually lowering their material production, for example, the material content of their whole value chain. So it's not just about carbon emissions. We need a lower material content of what we're producing. So the steel sector can actually transform in a more sustainable way if it lightens up steel production. In Germany, that pre-COVID was actually a condition through which, so the steel sector had to do that, and they did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle, not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose and stakeholder capitalism, but they had to in order to get a public loan from the public bank. So, now Rishi Sunak is saying that they want to actually set up a whole infrastructure bank and a public fund, kind of a new public bank, unless that nests within that a different narrative of what it means for the state to act in the economy. It's going to be a wasted opportunity. So really introducing conditionality to steer economy, to be less financialized, to be greener, to be investing in workers and all the conditions they actually require to be, not only healthy, but also productive member of society. So to be able to transition along with digitalization instead of blaming the robots. It's not the robots' fault that we haven't been investing in the workforce. Yeah, anyway, so all these things can be nested within the contracts, the collaborations, the form of partnerships that we have. There's nothing utopian about it. We've decided not to do that. Let's decide to do that.
Brilliant stuff from both our extremely esteemed guests. A real tour de force there. And I can see from the comments we've had in, huge appreciation. We're beyond lucky to have two economists of the stature and insight of both Mariana and Ha-Joon. So give a round of applause wherever you are to both our brilliant guests. And make sure you share this video as well. This video obviously will now be turned into a video which will be online. Share the link on Facebook, Twitter. Get your friends to read their books, to buy their books. This is how we turn the narrative around. We get these messages out. We build support within our communities, our workplace, unions, within the Labour Party or wherever, and our networks across the world. So a huge thanks for the insight, the wisdom, and also the optimism. So thank you so much to Mariana and Ha-Joon, and I will see you both soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. That was, as I said, a genuine tour de force. I learned a huge amount, and I'm sure many of you did as well. So do spread the word. As I've said, we've got so many videos coming up. I can reveal we've got some pretty incredible interviews ranging from Noam Chomsky to Peter Hitchens. Don't say that our interviews are not eclectic. They certainly are. We have this video coming up next week about migrants and refugees, in which we went to Folkestone to speak to people who've been airbrushed out of this so-called debate in which migrants and refugees are demonized and scapegoated for the injustices you've just heard Mariana and Ha-Joon describe so eloquently, rather than those at the top of society, the politicians and the various elites. It's those who have desperately fled violence from Iraq and Syria, and I speak to those some of those voices. If you want us to make more of those videos, which we're determined to do, please do support us. Patreon/OwenJones84. There's a brilliant team on union wages during the economic crisis we've just heard. So having those media workers employed doing incredible stuff, I think is pretty cool. So we've got loads of interviews coming up. Do send your suggestions. As I've said, very eclectic guests. That was a brilliant show from both of them. And again, I must emphasize this. Don't just subscribe. Do subscribe. Obviously, tell everyone to subscribe to this channel. Press the bell, and then you get notifications. So you'll instantly be told on your phone created by public entrepreneurship, as Mariana went into. You'll get notifications telling you when these videos are up. As I've said, ranging from these brilliant economists to stories about migrants and refugees, to the very eclectic set of interviews we've got coming up. So thank you very much. And a huge apologies for my jumper. I've gone through a lot of complaints about this Star Wars Christmas themed jumper. Actually, I'm not ashamed. And if you think this is bad now, wait till next week. You're in for a treat. I will let you know who the guests are for next week. But thank you for tuning in. Lots of love, everyone. I'll see you soon.